Hi, I'm Susan Swain, host of C-SPAN's Q&A, where we spend an hour with nonfiction writers and historians who add context to today's news. Our guest is attorney Greg Francis, lead counsel in the historic Black farmers class action litigation against the federal government. His book, Just Harvest, tells the story of the obstacles faced by black farmers since the end of the Civil War. It also recounts the unequal treatment they received throughout the 20th century in U.S. Agriculture Department programs. 2 landmark civil suits brought billions of dollars in redress for the farmers and their heirs, and hope for change within the USDA. Our conversation will begin in just a moment. Greg Francis, you've got a new book out called Just Harvest. What's its story?
Good morning, Susan, and thank you for having me. This is a story that depicts the plight of black farmers in America, and a landmark case, Pigford versus Glickman, and the following case, In-Rate Black Farmers, which dealt with systemic discrimination by the USDA against black farmers that really decimated the population of black farmers, contributed to them leaving the farms, as well as losing land and the familial structure that goes along with being a farmer.
What were the years of the specific settlements of these 2 cases?
This case, in fact, really dealt with the discrimination between 1981 and 1996. The USDA had a program, or has programs, where they go out and they give farmers supplements for expansion of their land, sometimes loan for seeds and whatnot. And this dealt with the denial of black farmers during that period of time to get the same type of relief, same type of support that they were giving to the white farmers.
And how large was the settlement in the case?
The settlement in this case, in this portion of the case, was $1.25 billion.
And how many farmers collected from that?
In terms of that were successful, there were almost 20,000 farmers or their descendants who ultimately were able to reap the benefits of this settlement as a result of, putting their information out there and having it evaluated and proving that they were, in fact, one of the farmers that were discriminated against.
What was your specific role in this litigation?
I was, and I remain today, one of the 3 lead counsel in this case. As lead counsel, we are responsible for the direction of the case, the litigation, the strategy, and ultimately all the work that has to be done or had to be done in terms to bring this to fruition, to work out a settlement agreement, and then make sure that there was a process in place for the farmers to have their grievances heard, a process in place to provide assistance to the farmers in filling out the claims forms, and ultimately distribution of the funds.
How much of the history or stories of black farmers were you aware of before you got involved with this litigation?
The reality of it is, growing up in Florida and coming to this country from Panama, I knew nothing about the plight of these black farmers. It was as a result of me working for my office in Mississippi, and we started getting calls from farmers about this portion of the case. When I inquired more, and when I spoke to Mike Espy, who was a former Secretary of Agriculture, I started to learn the lessons of black farmers and how they'd been discriminated against. To me, it was unfathomable. It was one of those things that I thought, this can't be real. But the more conversations I had with the individual farmers throughout the time that I was involved in this case, I saw that it was something that was systemic and that their story had never been told and it needed to be told.
How do you think their stories fit into the larger conversation that's happening in this country right now over racial justice?
I think that the black farmer case, or the case that I was involved in, brought about a bunch of awareness because, as I said, I wasn't really familiar with it. And I think that most of America was not familiar with the treatment or the mistreatment of black farmers and how it was really affecting them. By this case coming forward by the USDA admitting that there was discrimination and that there was going to be some compensation, I think it brought a new awareness and it shined a new light in an aspect of America that many times most of us don't think of. We go to the grocery store and simply pick the food that we want to eat, but we don't understand or really care, for that matter, how those products came to market. So I think it shifted the focus to the black farmers, to what their contribution was and is, and as a result of that, now going forward, that there's a new awareness that has resulted in additional subsidies and a better understanding of black farmers and their plight.
Readers of your book will find, at least I did, that it's really three things in one cover, Just Harvest. It's a part memoir, it's part history lesson, and a part policy book. So let me start with the memoir part of it. You tell us, as a reader, a bit about your upbringing. You referenced growing up in the Panama Canal Zone. What were the important things to know about your early formative years and how they influenced you?
I'm a proud descendant of Afro-American people who came to Panama from Barbados in order to build the Panama Canal. And I think that's important to note, and it's part of my history, given that even then and in Panama, the workers were paid different wages. However, because of the hard work of my great-grandfathers and grandfathers, they were able to make a living for their family. That's something that I grew up understanding, a value of self-worth, of personal identification. There's a story of my grandmother very early on telling me that I was special, not special in terms of someone who is privileged or special in a braggadocious way, but special in terms of our belief in God and our ability to go forward and do great things. So that's something that I kept with me as I matriculated from Panama to the United States. I was taken away from all the family I knew. My father at the time brought to America, and for a while it was a bit of a shock. But what I could rely on was those familial values that I had learned prior to coming to America, and it helped me to expand and to thrive in America. In addition, while I was here, there were people who were not necessarily my immediate family, a community of people who would come around and help me or have helped me in terms of getting through school, undergrad and law school.
To follow up with that, first of all, you referenced the specialness that comes from your faith. You've referenced faith a number of points in the book. How has it influenced your career progression and the kinds of cases you take and the person that you are today?
It's really the essence of who I am, and that is, a God-fearing man, and understand that also plays a part in my sense of justice. My sense of justice is honed from a very early age, and it's one of those things that has guided me in terms of fighting for the underdog, for speaking for those who can't speak for themselves.
And then also, tell me about your path to law school.
I entered the University of Florida as a very naive freshman, intending to be an engineer at the time. I had done well in high school. But what I quickly realized when I got to the University of Florida is that this was a very, very different environment. This was 50,000 students in one place. We had huge classes with 600-700 people at a time. But of those 50,000 students, less than 2,000 of those students were African American. So I learned that there were really two systems in play at the same time. That I was not necessarily being invited to the same study groups as others, and not able to necessarily adapt to the University of Florida initially. Fortunately for me, I joined a fraternity, and through that group of men, many of which were older than me, I was able to get a sense of identity, confidence in order to move forward, as well as direction of where to go. So many of my fraternity brothers had been preparing and had prepared to go to law school. It was not something that I thought about initially, but ultimately, by the time I got to be a senior, I recognized that graduate school was something that was going to be necessary for me, and I applied to only one law school. Again, naive, only one law school, the University of Florida, and luckily by the grace of God, was accepted there.
I know you remain involved with the University of Florida today. You write about a scholarship program that you've developed there. So what are the circumstances like for students today? I would imagine the demographics have shifted since you started.
I think the demographics have shifted, but one of the things that I'm trying to help shift is the support of African-American potential lawyers getting into law school and being able to afford it. One of the things that was most challenging to me and caused me the most stress when I was in law school is the lack of finances, not being able to, worrying about what I'm going to eat as opposed to studying necessarily. So one of the things that I wanted to do and to give back, to plant a seed, is with incoming Black law students to provide a scholarship to them. Now, this scholarship is specifically targeted towards graduates of HBCUs, historically Black universities and colleges, because it is my hope, my goal, to make sure that there is a diverse population in the law school, that we're graduating more African-American lawyers who in fact can pick up the mantle and continue to fight for justice.
So let me move on to the history section of your book. You give readers a real overview of the successive agriculture policies, decisions, and laws that have really influenced the fate of Black farmers really since the end of the Civil War. So I want to touch on a couple of those points just so people can learn much of the tale that you tell. So as the Civil War drew to a close, give me a sense of the landscape, the approximate population of African Americans who were in southern states that would have been moving into agricultural, the economy there.
Yeah, there were close to 1 million African Americans that were moving into farming at that time. But we have to go back a little further before that and kind of set the stage for that. These slaves that were brought to America, the only thing that they were able to bring, the only luggage per se that they had, was their knowledge of farming, of working the land. So they were brought to America, they would work the land, and then ultimately after the Emancipation Proclamation, they were now free to be able to do and to apply their own trade. Well, many of these farmers went out, and some of them became very successful entrepreneurs with the land that they were able to access, either through money they had saved or through sharecropping. However, very quickly after the Emancipation Proclamation, we know that President Lincoln was killed. Well, it was President Lincoln's goal at the time, and one of the tenets that he was putting forward was that the land between Charleston, South Carolina, and St. Augustine, Florida, was going to be granted to Black farmers. This is coastal land, very fertile land, and they were going to be able to go in and work this land and govern themselves, essentially. Well, as we know, 6 days later, President Lincoln was killed. President Jackson came in. Vice President Jackson ascended to the presidency, and that whole plan was nixed. And that was put aside. And that really began just this systemic, constantly over and over again, discrimination and disparate treatment of Black farmers.
Most of our listeners will recall hearing the phrase 40 acres and a mule. Who made that promise and what happened to it?
Well, that was one of the promises at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation, that the slaves would be granted 40 acres and a mule. And that's where this really came from. And part of that was the land that was supposed to be set aside, as I mentioned before.
From that era of time, you walk readers through a number of systems that developed economically. Peonage systems, later on sharecropping systems. First of all, peonage, that's a term I'm sure not everybody's going to be familiar with it. What is it? How did that system work?
That system basically worked as the farmers would go in and work the land of someone else, and in working that land, they would be paid a percentage. The unfortunate part of it is those farmers would never own that land, and the percentage that they were being paid to work the land ultimately resulted in them constantly being further and further in debt.
You also tell some harrowing stories of convict labor, forced labor, more or less. Can you tell us a bit about the history of that period?
Sure. There were a number of laws that were in place that were intended to keep the farmers, Black farmers, from really expanding. And some of those were, for instance, you had to have a contract signed of work for a year, and you had to work that year. And if you weren't working, then you could be put in jail. So the government at the time turned the jail system and prisoners into farmers in order to get ahead.
How long did that last?
That lasted probably 40 or 50 years, and I think it really turned into what we saw as chain gangs later on in life. But it was a process that continued on for tens of years.
It was a period of time, especially in the early 1900s, when there was a great tradition of muckraking journalism. Did journalists of the period cover these systems so that it was more widely known around the country that this was happening?
Absolutely not. There was absolutely no coverage of these type of atrocities that were happening to the black farmers. In fact, that's why it was able to proliferate, because there was such a disconnect between farming communities in different states, even in the same state, but in different areas. So many of these farmers suffered in silence, thinking that it was only them that were being discriminated against, only them being denied these opportunities. It's not like we have today with social media and all the different contacts or mediums we have now to get the word out. There was no documentation of this. There was no discussion of this. How
were you able to learn some of the history of the period then?
Really through my research, but also through just talking to the farmers throughout the years of being involved in this case. And they would tell harrowing stories of their hard work, their willingness to try to get ahead, to raise a family, to pass down the generational wealth that goes along with owning the land that they were working. And ultimately, I found that, in 1910, black farmers owned about 15 million acres. By the time 1969, less than 6 million acres. So this had been a constant attrition of black farmers because of the discrimination, either leaving the farm or their children who grew up and that went to college and then understood the last thing they wanted to do was go back to the farm where their parents had not been treated fairly.
Is that greatly different than what was happening to small white farmers during the period?
It's different in terms of the amount of attrition that we have. Again, around 1920, there was probably 926,000 black farmers. By the time I got in the case, there was less than 20,000 black farmers. There was a move away from an agricultural-based system here in America across the board. However, when you look at it, the disparate numbers between how many black farmers left versus how many white farmers left, you see that there was a disparate impact on the black farmers.
Would you also explain, while we're talking about some of the farm economies that impacted black farmers, what sharecropping is and how it differs from peonage?
Sharecropping is, again, working the land of someone else, that someone has a farm and you have an agreement with the owner of the land to come in and to work the land. And usually sharecropping, the big difference is that you're usually able to get a larger percentage of the farm or of the proceeds from the farm that you raise. So, but you never own the land, and ultimately you work at the will of the owner of the land.
So, what was the general economic fate of sharecroppers? How did their personal economies tend to turn out?
Most of their economies turned out to where they were probably just a step above peonage because they were not able to ultimately get ahead. The rules would be changed in terms of what amount of the proceeds they were supposed to get. And it was always uncertain as to whether they were going to be able to continue to work the land. If they disagreed with anything, the simple solution for that for the landowner would be to get them off the land and to bring someone else in. So it was really a system that was not beneficial ultimately for black farmers, but that was the only trade that they knew at the time. So they suffered in that.
The farm economy took a quadruple whammy in the late 1920s, early 1930s, the combined impact of the Great Depression, boll weevil infestation, poor crop management, and at least 4 major droughts. Farming as a whole was devastated. What was the particular impact on black farming?
Well, again, this really highlights exactly how, and is one example of how exactly black farmers were impacted with this. The U.S. government, the USDA, understanding the fragility of the food system here in America, but how important it was to make sure that there was food on the plates of Americans every day, decided to step in and give subsidies, sometimes in the form of loans, sometimes in the form of grants to farmers to help prop up that system, to make sure that the farmers were still going to be able to make a living while they were putting food on everyone's table. So, but as the system was being implemented, as the loans were being given, as the grants were being given to the farmers systemically across the country, especially in the Deep South, black farmers were being denied many times. And I heard stories of some black farmers saying that, their white farmer friends who were their neighbors would tell them, hey, go down to the USDA office. There are loans that are available. The money's in, or they're giving out loans now. And those same black farmers would go down there after being notified by many of their neighbors that this money was available, and would just be systemically denied. Either their applications would not be considered, they'd be given the runaround. Farming is a very time-sensitive trade, and you have to plant the crops by a certain time. So they were being denied and just falling further and further behind, not being able to pay their bills, to expand their land, to buy new equipment, to put into place new technologies. They were being denied. So the gap between black and white farmers just became an increasing gap of access.
As you learned more in your work on the case, and then later on in your work on the book, what were your conclusions about the root causes of this culture of discrimination within the USDA?
I think the root causes of the discrimination with the USDA was really the fact that the lack of awareness that the USDA had of putting in charge individuals, many of which were not necessarily farmers, but putting in charge folks who, in fact, had always had, a discriminatory background. There was no oversight over exactly, and no evaluation of who was getting the loans out in the farm area. So I think it really became a situation where each individual USDA office in their respective region would do it a little differently. However, the people who were implementing the program that was supposed to be for everyone were really the ones who were deciding to not include black folks or black farmers in the loans.
Do you remember a particular story from this era that will take it from the policy discussion to make it personal for people who are listening?
From this period of time, I mean, there are stories of John Boyd and of Gary Grant. These are great farm advocates that continue to advocate for black farmers today, but how they were graduates and well educated and went to seek loans to open their own farms, and ultimately were denied. Fortunately for them, and fortunately for America, those farmers did not just simply give up with that. They understood that they had the qualifications as everyone else, and therefore continued to advocate on behalf of black farmers. Mike Espy tells a story of being the son of a father who worked for the USDA, and hearing the stories growing up of the discrimination of the black farmers. So when he became Secretary of Agriculture, one of his first days, he sent someone down to the basement to get the letters of the complaints of the farmers so that he could evaluate them, because it was a promise he had made to his father. And in evaluating that, he understood or recognized that this was not something that was simply happened in the area of Mississippi that he grew up in, but this was something that was systemic. It was going on all across America. And the USDA was complicit in it because the complaints of the black farmers were never addressed.
Many of the modern day farm policies grew out of decisions made by the Roosevelt era, and you are critical of a number of those. What are some that had the greatest negative impact from that era?
I think the greatest impact from that area is, again, just the lack of access, the lack of oversight of these funds that, was billed as, an attempt to prop up farmers. So the failure to properly and equally implement those programs were what I think led to ultimately something that just continued year after year, decade after decade.
Throughout your history, the Supreme Court and decisions that it makes play important roles. During the Roosevelt era, the Agricultural Adjustment Act was passed, and the Supreme Court overturned it, and then allowing for the facts that it would be the states rather than the federal government to control agriculture. Do I have that correct? And if so, what was the impact of that decision?
Well, as you can surmise, or as the listeners will know, is Jim Crow was in place in the South, and with the Jim Crow, those are the folks who would be in charge of these systems. So while it was a federal system that was being governed by the state, the implementation of the programs, the dissemination of money was done in a way that was just continued to be discriminatory and matched or mirrored what was going on in America at the time.
So let's fast forward our story to the more recent era, 1980s, for example. A lot of changes, technological changes going on in farming, a lot of consolidation of farms with large corporations. Let's bring the story up to that era and give me a sense of what it was like for black farmers as we entered, for example, the 1980s.
It continued to be the same thing. Although there was a consolidation of farms and large mega farms coming into play and coming into vogue at the time, the plight of black farmers had really not changed. They were still being discriminated against. They were still being denied access to loans and different grants. So it was a very hard living at the time.
You mentioned a few names, and we found some examples of people who began to form coalitions to address the situations that they found untenable. Let's start with one of them who you referenced. His name is Gary Grant. We have a bit of video of him from C-SPAN's archive, and then I'd like to have you tell a little bit more about this gentleman and the role he played in the black farmer's story. Let's watch.
I'm asking you today. My father is 78 years old. My mother is 75, who's been told by a federal judge that he was too old at 62 to go into bankruptcy, who has suffered humiliation in his community because he dared to be a man and stand for what was right. I want the benefits of the men who took my parents' livelihood and took our livelihood away.
That's Gary Grant testifying before Congress in 1997, using it as a way to introduce him to our viewers and again, ask you to tell us a little bit more about this gentleman's role.
Gary Grant grew up on a farm, and however, he was not a farmer. His parents were farmers. It's a funny story of him very early on trying to drive a tractor and driving it into a ditch. And he learned very early on that his trade was not going to be in farming. However, his parents were in farming, and they had farmed their entire lives. They'd raised a family on the farm, and ultimately were denied again loans, and where the USDA was in fact trying to foreclose on them for a small loan that they had received. And Gary Grant took up the mantle, fighting for his parents, took it all the way to Congress, and advocated for black farmers, specifically his parents, but for black farmers as a whole. And again, bringing a new awareness to this entire problem, that this was an issue and that this was unfair and that it needed to be addressed.
Here's another person you referenced, John Boyd Jr., who became a spokesperson for black farmers. This particular clip is speaking at a rally in 2002. Let's watch.
I was one that was victimized by the United States Department of Agriculture, where they threw my application in the trash can. And when they asked him about it, they said, yes, he did it. He asked, did he have a problem making African-American loans? He said, yes. They were lazy and wanted a paycheck on Friday. That's the kind of blatant discrimination that African-American farmers have been experiencing for decades. Now, you have to keep in mind, we didn't ask to be here, but we're certainly asking to take place in a country that ought to treat every man and citizen as one person, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Somebody know what I'm talking about today.
Mr. Francis, he formed the National Black Farmers Association in 1995. What was he able to accomplish with that?
By forming that association, John Boyd has been one of the leaders at the forefront of this fight for the plight of black farmers, for bringing awareness of their plight to America, as well as advocating in the Congress, and ultimately was very, very influential and very beneficial for ultimately the resolution of this case. John Boyd continues this day to fight on behalf of black farmers, and I applaud him for his efforts, and those like him who took up the mantle and understood that it was not just about their individual plight, but the plight of an entire segment of the population who were being discriminated against.
So we saw in those clips these gentlemen employing traditional coalition building techniques, testifying before Congress, speaking at rallies in Washington, D.C., obviously with the goal of influencing legislation, a legislative outcome. What was the Congress not responsive to the needs of black farmers during this period?
No, again, it was. I think it was a lack of awareness. You know, this system of systemic discrimination was so subtle and we were so disconnected. The farmers were so disconnected that there didn't seem to be a groundswell, a movement amongst legislators in order to address this issue. So by John Boyd and others like him bringing this to the forefront, putting it in front of Congress, there began some discussion of what went on. And there were a number of studies that were done that document the systemic dissemination or the systemic decline of the number of black farmers and the reasons why. That you know, black farmers were disproportionately, they would get a very small percentage of the loans that were put out, although they really were a larger part of the population of black farmers.
How did the strategy develop to end up suing the U.S. Department of Agriculture?
This policy really, or this theory really developed by J.L. Chestnut and Al Pires. And one of the things that happened is when President Reagan became president, he removed the Office of Civil Rights in the USDA. So there was no one for black farmers to complain to when they feel like they had been discriminated against. There was no redress. So as a result of not having that redress, we were able to go back. Al Pires and Mr. Chestnut went back and were able to go all the way back to 1981 through 1996 to look at those and look at the plight of black farmers and see whether they could prove that they were in fact discriminated against.
The lawsuit ultimately was named Pigford versus Glickman. We have a video of Timothy Pigford. Let's watch, and you can explain how his name came to be on this lawsuit.
We are one of the 4 minority groups that are asking for justice for Hispanic farmers, Native American farmers, and female farmers, that they may receive justice. I have written a letter to President Obama asking that he close the book on this issue of discrimination at USDA, and that he truly close this book and end the corridor of shame that has been placed upon these 4 minority groups ever since 1935.
Greg Francis, how did Tim Pigford end up having his name on this major lawsuit?
Timothy Pigford was one of the farmers that ultimately Mike Espy, while he was Secretary of Agriculture, had identified as having a very valid case. And, Mr. Pickford, all he wanted to do was farm. And he had been denied the loans. He'd been denied access despite the fact that he had fit all the criteria. So his name became kind of the name for the lawsuit because ultimately once Mike Espy was resigned and Mr. Glickman came into place, Mr. Glickman decided that the award that Secretary Espy was going to grant to Mr. Pickford would not be given, that in fact they were not going to compensate him, and that resulted in a lawsuit after Mr. Pickford had already demonstrated to the USDA the discrimination that he had experienced.
Dan Glickman, as Agriculture Secretary, came from Kansas. He represented Kansas in the Congress. What do you have to say about his approach or attitude about the story of the black farmers?
Really, Mr. Glickman's role in this was synonymous with what has happened to African-American farmers all along, is that they would be promised something, some type of relief that was ultimately taken away from them. Mike Espy, when he was the Secretary of Agriculture, was going to compensate Mr. Pickford and probably begin a series of evaluations of the black farmers and their plight and whether they were discriminated against. Mr. Glickman came in and undid all of those things. He essentially brought it back to status quo and was not going to address and refused to address the plight of the black farmers.
So what was the route from becoming a case about Timothy Pickford to becoming a class action lawsuit?
Well, once the case was filed on behalf of Timothy Pickford, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of other black farmers who were similarly situated. Their stories may differ a little in terms of how they were discriminated against or when they were discriminated against or the form. However, there seemed to be a groundswell of understanding that this, in fact, was going to be addressed in the Pickford case. So that one Pickford case resulted in a number of filings by different attorneys in different states, and ultimately, for judicial economy, was consolidated into a class action.
So during this period of time, it seems like it started to become very active on the national front. What was the role of Congress and particularly the Congressional Black Caucus during this period of time?
The Black Caucus began to advocate for this. This became, again, there was a new awareness of the plight of the black farmers, and they began to advocate for change in the legislation and how the USDA was practicing. Ultimately, in 2008, the Farm Bill granted access to additional farmers who had not had their cases heard on the merits to have their cases heard in order to determine whether they, in fact, had been discriminated against.
And where did you enter the story? What year?
I entered the case right around that time, 2008, when the Farm Bill passed. As a result of my work in Mississippi at the time, as I said, I began being contacted by a number of different farmers. When I heard their stories, as I said before, it was mind-blowing and almost unbelievable at times. But when you heard the same story over and over and over again, you began to realize that this was something that was systemic and that these farmers had stories that needed to be told.
Before we move to the 2008, there's some important pieces of information that happened. First of all, did you see support for the black farmers that was beginning to develop as a partisan issue? Because you make reference to several Republicans who seemed sympathetic, including former Speaker Newt Gingrich, Congressman Steve Chabot of Ohio, Senator Chuck Grassley, who himself is a farmer. Is this about partisanship or something else?
Well, it's really about something else. There was some partisanship. However, there seemed to be a coalition ultimately of both sides, both parties, in terms of understanding the plight of black farmers. And again, I would take this back to that was as a result of the new awareness of exactly what was going on. You know, these black farmers had suffered in silence for so long that ultimately when it became not necessarily a partisan issue, but an issue of addressing what was going on in rural America.
In April of 1999 was the settlement of the first case. The judge involved was named Friedman. He issued a 65-page opinion. and a $2 billion settlement on this case. What is important to know about Judge Friedman and his opinion and how it influenced this whole process?
Judge Friedman was and still remains involved in the black farmer case. Now we are working on the end of the black farmers case in terms of using the money that was left over after the settlement. However, Judge Friedman was very, very, very committed to seeing justice done in this case. He encouraged both sides to negotiate some type of settlement, but he also documented in his 65-page opinion just instances after instances of discrimination that were demonstrated to him and why it was important to compensate the black farmers.
Why was Pigford 2 necessary? In other words, why didn't more claimants actually seek redress and find it under the first case's settlement?
Well, you have to look back at history. And in this case, for tens of years, for as long as they could remember, black farmers would be denied these loans and access to different programs from the USDA. So once information came out there that USDA was going to, in fact, address the discrimination, most farmers just didn't believe it. They didn't believe that the government that had discriminated against them for so long was finally going to, in fact, really hear their grievances and potentially compensate them. So between that and a lack of communication, a lack of connectivity amongst the black farmers and getting the information out that, in fact, there was a settlement led to the vast majority of black farmers not participating or sending in their claims forms very late after the deadline that Judge Friedman had set.
So what was needed to encourage more people into the process? More dollars, more education, all of the above?
All of the above, but really there needed to be more education of the farmers and exactly what was being compensated and what information they would have. As a result of that, one of the things that I did as lead counsel is I would go from small town to small town, traveling thousands of miles in a car, going from town to town and giving press conferences ahead of claims meetings that we were having to notify those farmers who had been aggrieved, were on a list of potential farmers that just had not had their grievances heard, but to really get out there and meet them kind of face-to-face, hand-to-hand, as well as on the evening news in these rural areas. Farmers work all day, so they don't watch TV, so commercials and that type of thing were not really beneficial. But typically when you get home, you will watch the news, and that was one of the ways that I thought was the best and most effective way of educating farmers on the possibility of having their grievances heard.
What was the specific role of then Senator Barack Obama and the 2008 Farm Bill?
Senator Obama at the time actually was one of the co-sponsors of the Farm Bill, which set aside a small amount of money, $50 million at the time. $50 million $50 million at the time for to address the farmers that had not participated in the initial settlement. However, we knew that there were there were almost 70,000 farmers who had been put on this list that had, in fact, submitted their grievances, but were late in submitting their grievances. And that pot of money was used to begin the second part of this case. Now, ultimately, that $50 million was not going to be enough to compensate the number of farmers that ultimately came forward and were granted relief in this case. But he was the co-sponsor of that bill to kind of get the process started.
We have about 15 minutes left in our conversation. I have President Obama on video from December of 2010, speaking during the signing of the Claims Resolution Act of 2010. Let's watch, and you can explain his support of this and what it ultimately did.
For many years, African American farmers claimed they were discriminated against when they applied for federal farm loans, making it more difficult for them to stay in business and maintain their farms. In 1999, a process was established to settle these claims, but the settlement was implemented poorly and tens of thousands of African American families who filed paperwork after the deadline were denied their chance to make their case. And that's why, as Senator, I introduced legislation to provide these farmers the right to have their claims heard. That's why I'm proud that Democrats and Republicans have come together to lay this case to rest. And that's why I'm proud that Secretary Vilsack and everybody at the Department of Agriculture are continuing to address claims of past discrimination by other farmers throughout our country.
Greg Francis, what did the Claims Resolution Act do?
The Claims Resolution Act was exactly what I said, that $50 million that was set aside to begin the process of evaluating exactly how many farmers, in fact, had not had an opportunity to have their cases heard on the merits. So that kind of began the process, and then ultimately it was a negotiation, a back and forth with the Obama administration through the USDA as well as the U.S. Attorney's Office in order to facilitate and ultimately coalesce on exactly how much money would ultimately be appropriated to address the farmers who had not had a chance to have their cases heard previously.
And what was that second sum?
That second sum ultimately was $1.25 billion.
So between the two cases, how much money was appropriated?
Between the two cases is almost probably close to $2.5 million that was appropriated.
$2.5 billion.
Billion.
Right.
Sorry.
So once that law passed, you talk about educating people to make claims. You talk about your law firm having to be convinced at first that it was appropriate to be involved in this process, and the amount of money your law firm spent without knowing you would be compensated for it to try to bring people in the system. Tell me that part of the story.
Well, you know, what we do in the type of law that I practice is we really work on a contingency fee basis, which means we don't get any money until, you know, we get some type of resolution. So, you know, these farmers who had been discriminated against that were losing their farms, they certainly didn't have money to put up to hire lawyers and to pay for the claims process that was being put in place. So initially, my law firm was open to listening to this case. However, given the initial set aside of only $50 million and understanding the number of farmers that were out there, we were really taking a chance on that there would be more money appropriated and that there would be ultimately money set aside for the payment of attorney's fees as well. So it did take some convincing, but, you know, once I had heard the stories of the farmers, I became personally convicted with the plight of the farmers, of their stories, and that justice needed to be, they needed justice in this case. So, you know, really, I moved ahead with the case and was spending money and not necessarily getting approval all the time for it. And ultimately, we look up and we are millions of dollars invested in this case without the understanding that we were going to be compensated for it. Ultimately, we were, because there was that ultimate appropriation. But for a period of several years there, it was really a thought of whether we had invested all this money and time and whether the farmers were going to be compensated fairly, and whether we were going to be paid for our time and investment. So
here are the numbers that you report in Just Harvest, ultimately. 40,000 claims forms submitted, 32,587 of them completed on time, one of the stipulations. Claims administrators approved 17,000 cases to receive $62,500 each, total of $1.1 billion, and 1,200 of those claimants came through your law firm. Since you know a number of those personal stories, what ultimately was the effect of the successful settlement on these individuals' lives? What happened to them?
That many of the people who ultimately received the settlements were descendants of many of these farmers. You know, 62.5 is a sum of money, but it doesn't even come close to compensating the farmers for what they had been through, for the land that they had lost, for the opportunity that they lost, for the generational wealth that had been lost by these farmers. So it was really more than the money. It was really an acknowledgement by the government that, in fact, there was discrimination. And the benefit to the farmers really was that they now had finally been heard, that they had been heard and vindicated in terms of their complaints that they had for many, many years.
So Tim Pigford makes reference, and you tell in your book about the fact that his case, the class action case, paved the way for other large class action cases regarding farmers. For example, $760 million awarded in Keepseagle class action for Native American farmers, $3.4 billion in Cobell versus Salazar, and then another case for Hispanic farmers, Garcia versus Vilsack. You start to add up the billions of dollars that was adjudicated in these cases. And let me just make a statement and see if you agree with it, that it's ended up costing the taxpayers a lot of money to redress these claims from the Agriculture Department, and a lot of heartache in people's lives, that if they just followed the programs as they originally had been intended, it wouldn't end up costing so much in lives and taxpayer dollars.
Exactly. I see these settlements as an investment back into farming for all of these different minority groups. We have to really go back and look at what exactly was lost by Black farmers and Indian farmers and whatnot. But, as a result of their lack of access to these loans, many times they moved away or they lost land, not only lost land, but lost the familiar structure that is synonymous with being on a farm and raising a family and doing it together. All those things were lost. So while it was we can add those numbers up together, we'd have to look back at, what was really lost in this case. Remember now the $1.25 billion in the previous settlement for the Pigford case really only addressed between 1981 and 1996. By that time, by 1981, many of the loss of Black farmers was rampant, and Black farms was rampant. So if we go all the way back and we try to put a price on that, try to quantify that, I think we'd understand that, in fact, that money does not fully compensate the farmers for what they've been through and for the generational discrimination that they experienced. So I think that we really need an evaluation of that in order or to put into perspective the ultimate number of money that was given to redress this. All these farmers wanted was the opportunity. They weren't asking for anything extra. The money had been appropriated. The programs had been put in place for the farmers. If we had simply or if America, the USDA had simply implemented the program as necessary, it would not have been as costly ultimately. And, these farmers who were not asking for anything extra would have made their own money.
Tom Vilsack is once again head of the Agriculture Department as Secretary. His name is on at least one of these big class action cases. I guess that leads to the question, has the culture changed at USDA?
It has been a very, very subtle and slow process. This is something that, because it had been in place for so long, it takes a while to root out that kind of thinking and access to these funds. Under the recent Trump administration, less than 1% of all farm loans were given to African American farmers, and this is in 2016 to 2020. So there is still some sense of concern by those like John Boyd, who continues to advocate, and others like him, Cornelius Blanding with the Southern cooperatives, that they continue to fight for Black farmers that continue to be discriminated against. So there has been some progress, and I think that this Pigford case is part of that progress and shining a light on it and awareness. And ultimately, we see in this recent COVID appropriations bill that Black farmers were granted $5 billion of debt relief, which again, I think is a second step after the initial Pigford case of addressing the plight of black farmers.
How were the legal fees paid for the individuals in the class action suit?
Because it was a class action suit, the judge in this case had a range that was part of the settlement agreement of what ultimately the lawyers would be paid in the case. And there was a range because the judge, of course, wanted to hold the lawyers' feet to the fire to make sure that they, in fact, were working on behalf of the farmers. So ultimately, Judge Friedman decided what the fee was for the attorneys. And I can tell you that someone who works as contingency fee, it was much less than we would normally earn on a contingency fee basis.
You're putting some of the money that you earn towards a Just Harvest Foundation. What do you want to do with it?
The money for the Just Harvest Foundation is to provide access to African Americans who want to go into farming, but also those who want to go into law and the practice of law. One of the main tenets of that is the scholarship that I've established at the University of Florida for students who graduate from HBCUs so that we can have additional African Americans that I think will add to the diversity and therefore add to the education at the University of Florida, but also that will go out and seek justice for everyone.
So as we close here, you write in the book, as you learned in the investigation and research part of this, and as you met these people, your primary reaction was anger. Where are you today when you look back on how this has been settled? And I guess I'm wondering how this has all impacted you and how you're viewing the process that these people went through and how the United States handled it.
It's really changed my practice, and it's changed the way that I practice law in real life every day. As a result of reliving this case again and over and writing this book, I still get angry. And I hope that those who read the book get angry as well and ultimately understand what has occurred so that it won't happen again. You know, in working on this case, I understood that two things that developed out of it, which is hope, that we have to have hope going forward, that without that hope, without that desire to get ahead, without that chance to get ahead, that this whole American system, in fact, would collapse. And the other part is community. You know, as I said, when I came here to America, many people helped me along the way that were just a part of the community. In listening to these farmers and understanding that they were now putting their confidence in me to speak for them in the courtroom, to speak for them and for their families for so many years, I learned a sense of community that just like others had helped me in my matriculation to my current position, that it was now my role to return that favor and help these farmers.
Greg Francis' book is called Just Harvest. Mr. Francis, thank you so much for spending an hour with C-SPAN. Nice to meet you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Q&A, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're there, please take a minute to rate and review us. You can also send us an email about Q&A at podcasts@c-span.org. Send me your questions, your comments, or ideas. Your feedback is welcome.